My name is Zohar, and today I'm going to discuss with you some of the principles that I believe are very, very important and central to Jewish and Israel education. Welcome to this session. I must admit that it's a bit awkward to speak like that to a camera without a live audience, but we will do our best to make the best of it. So I'd like to start by saying that the role of the Jewish and Israel educator, in my mind, is to traverse Jewish spaces and Jewish times on behalf of the Jewish community, explore those spaces and times, and come back to the community with a meaningful story. And by meaningful story, I mean a story that is worth both remembering and remembering, which means it's not only a story that stimulates our memory cells and has us wish to remember that story as part of who we are, but it is also a story that elicits engagement, remembering, allows the listener, the participant, to become engaged with the story and with its perpetual evolution. In that respect, the educator from this standpoint is not a storyteller, but what I render a story bearer. And the distinction between those two means that a story bearer is someone who now furnishes a story which he or she has a personal stake at. We're telling a story that is part of our own lives. As a people, as individuals, as members of a community, we have a stake not only in telling the story, but in perpetuating it and being engaged in it. In simpler terms, we're telling our own story as a people. So in order to be an effective story bearer in that respect, I would like to outline a number of challenges and opportunities that I believe exist today in the world in which we operate. And the first step, of course, is to know who it is the audience we're dealing with. And here I'm targeting this session to the younger cohorts, young adults, with whom many of us engage, the ages of 17, 18 to 30. And I would like to outline 5 challenges that I believe exist today in the world of Jewish and Israel education. The 2 first ones actually pertain to the world in which we operate in general. They have nothing to do with the fact that you're Jewish or not. And the other 3 are more honed in on the Jewish and Israel conditions. So first of all, let me start us off by saying that I truly believe that the young generation with whom we work is a phenomenal generation. They are inquisitive, they are smart, they are intelligent, they seek meaning in life, and perhaps more than anything else, they believe in their ability to affect positive change on things that matter to them. Having said that, it is a generation that still works within a framework that presents to us the 5 challenges which I'm about to enumerate now. Challenge number 1 is that this generation operates in a world that demonstrates quite a disparity between very high levels of access to information and a much lower ability to engage knowledge in depth. In other words, it is a generation of surfers without a diving license. They surf, they don't dive. And the reason I use the metaphor of surfing is not only because that's the language we use when we talk about surfing the web, surfing the internet, and so on and so forth. But if you actually think about the act of surfing, people who surf in the ocean are attracted to whatever it is that makes waves. That's the inner logic of surfing. And indeed, today's young generation was born into a world that oftentimes deliberately, systematically, thoughtfully, intentionally creates waves for the perpetual consumption of the average surfer. They jump from headline to headline, from wave to wave, but they don't necessarily dive in the ocean. That's challenge number one. To make it even more challenging, challenge number two is that this generation operates in a world, and this is a phenomena we see all the way from the grassroots level of social discourse and up to the highest levels of leadership in our world, and that is an alarming disparity between low levels of knowledge and very, very high levels of opinion. People have a lot to say about things they know hardly anything about. In other words, we operate in a world today where people reach the discussion table, as it were, already armed with an entire arsenal of exclamation points and not necessarily question marks. The third challenge is now having to do with our own Jewish world. Many of our younger members were born and raised into a framework or a mind frame that truly makes them believe that Judaism is primarily, if not exclusively, a religion. Now, of course, I'm not saying that religion is not a fundamental part of the Jewish experience, but there's a huge difference between saying that religion is a fundamental part of the Jewish experience and saying that Judaism is a religion. This myopic lens through which people scan Judaism, that is, religious spaces, religious times, religious texts, religious rituals, and not much more outside of that outside of that orbit, is a very myopic lens and actually creates or robs our participants from a fuller appreciation of the Jewish experience. More than that, if we scan the pedagogy of Jewish educational institutes, we see that for the most part, the pedagogy of Jewish education revolved primarily around the question of how to be Jewish, rather than the question of why to be Jewish. Now, here again, I'm not undermining the importance of the question of how to be Jewish, that is, the practices, the texts, the knowledge, and so on and so forth. But for generations, we have ignored systematically, as part of a lacking educational pedagogy, a true, meaningful, rigorous engagement with the question of why to be Jewish. Not as a point of justification, but as a point of clarification, value clarification. What is the deeper meaning of being Jewish? In that respect, we built a Jewish educational edifice and a Jewish identity edifice that I like to render too much porch, but not enough house. Some people are maybe proficient with the Jewish practices, but they have absolutely no connection to the meaning that gave rise to those practices. The fourth challenge is that just as we have created a very myopic lens of appreciating Judaism, we have also needed to deal, or we still need to deal, with a very myopic lens of appreciating Israel. For the average surfer who does not necessarily dive, Israel is scanned and appreciated most often through a lens of its geopolitical reality. In other words, Israel equals the conflict. Again, one cannot blame the surfer, because if we actually scan the waves that are transmitted from the shores of Tel Aviv, as it were, to the shores of New York or any other big city or any other media portal, the waves that reach in regards to Israel are mostly geopolitical. And it creates a distortion of perception where the reality of Israel, that is multifaceted and has much more to do than its geopolitical reality, is again robbed from the radar screen, whereas the yoke of the appreciation of Israel is now geopolitical. And the fifth challenge is probably the most demanding in many ways and affects our educational arenas from many angles. And that is that the Jewish people have a great story. We have a great story to tell, but our narrative is fundamentally lacking. And by saying that, I mean that I maintain that the story of the Jewish people is a remarkable story to be told. If I started this session by saying that the educator is a story bearer that traverses spaces and times in order to come back with a meaningful story, a story to remember and remember, then I believe that the Jewish story, the story of our people throughout time, is a remarkable story. It is a story of a people who have convincingly and perpetually demonstrated an inverse relationship between numbers and impact. It is a story of a people who are responsible for some of the most fundamental values that have shaped Western society as we know it. It is a story of a people who have brought to the world some of the thought patterns, some of the most incredible innovations throughout time, some of the most remarkable novelties that assisted in advancing Western society as we know it today. It is a great story. The same goes for Israel. Putting all politics and cynicism aside, if one actually looks at the evolution of the state of Israel in the last 72 years and really looks and appreciates what they see around them, with all of the problems and with all of the challenges, it is truly a mind-boggling story. The story of the state of Israel, which is part of the story of the Jewish people, is a remarkable story. Our narrative, the way we've been telling the story of the Jewish people, and many times the story of Israel, is fundamentally lacking because the narrative of the Jewish people has been for generations a narrative that is deeply steeped in a rhetoric of crisis, in a rhetoric of persecution, in a rhetoric of calamity, of catastrophe, and not in a rhetoric of triumph, in a rhetoric of contribution, in a rhetoric of vitality. You all know the joke about the summation of all Jewish festivals. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Whereas it may be funny, it does have a yoke of truth to it. We have to ask ourselves today a fundamental question. Are we willing, as story bearers throughout the Jewish world, as those who were given the mandate by the Jewish people to traverse our own Jewish spaces and times, to come back with a narrative that truly pays homage to our story? These 5 challenges need to be addressed systematically, intentionally, and with a shared language in the Jewish world. And that's part of what we are trying to do also at the iCenter. So now I would like to give some tools to respond to those challenges and give you some preliminary language to think about as you proceed with your thoughts and discussions on these issues. First of all, when we talk about the disparity between a high level of accessibility to information and a much lower level of or ability to engage knowledge in depth, and when we talk about the disparity between lower levels of knowledge and very high levels of opinion, I believe that these traits demonstrate to us today, most tellingly, that in the 21st century, the true currency of education in general, and Jewish and Israel education as part of that framework, is going to be less and less content, and more context. In other words, if you think about it, in today's reality, in today's hyper-technological world, content is readily available to anyone who seeks it through technology. They don't need me, they don't need you, they don't need the teacher, they don't need the rabbi necessarily for content. They can access it, and they are much more proficient than us in accessing it. What is fundamentally lacking is the ability to situate content in the right context and the ability to engage that content within the context with its due complexity. In other words, two elements that are fundamentally important to any educational endeavor today, in my opinion, are context and complexity. And I'll give you an example about context, and you see how easily manipulation can occur if something is without context. I'm going to send a sentence to you now, which is like a wave, right? And then ask you a question. And it's a classical sentence that we all heard one time or another in the Jewish and Israeli circles. All Jews must leave their home countries and move to Israel. That's a wave, that's a sentence. Now here's a question for you. Did what I just say Zionistic or anti-Semitic? As you ponder over this question, I may remind you that almost the same sentence, verbatim, was uttered by people such as David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Hess, and others, who are obviously avid Zionists. Almost the same sentence was uttered by Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda for the Nazi regime. The difference is obviously the context. The former were inviting brothers and sisters, Jewish brothers and sisters, to the homeland. The latter was kicking Jews out of Europe. But the sentence remained the same. In other words, waves without the context of the ocean mean virtually nothing, or at the very least can be very easily manipulated in various forms. So context, complexity are founding blocks of a solid educational process today. Number two, Judaism is much more than a religion. And the question that we need to put before ourselves is, how do we expand the canvas of Jewish appreciation beyond religious terminologies, rituals, spaces, and times alone? How do we allow our participants an entryway into a Jewish experience that truly spans life itself and not only identifies with the religious aspect? And here again, I want to be understood in the right context. I'm not undermining the importance of religion, as I made very clear before. I'm just saying that religion does not encapsulate the totality of the Jewish experience. By doing that, the pedagogy that needs to be taken here has to be the reintroduction of the question, why be Jewish, into our educational pedagogy. And the question of why to be Jewish is a fundamental question for our audience. How do we allow them to understand that Judaism is not merely a set of practices or rituals, but rather that those practices, rituals, statements, books, ideas come to reflect the deepest form of quest for meaning and the deepest form of quest for personal and communal existence as a people. How do we bring the yoke of values and the deeper purpose behind Jewish life, and we not allow merely the triumph of ritual over meaning? Or in other words, we don't allow merely the ritual to overshadow the meaning, but present them both. The third point here in this section is that we need to do the same with the Israel experience, or with the presentation of Israel. How do we broaden the canvas or expand the canvas of Israel appreciation beyond its geopolitical reality? And here, amid many other tools, I believe that one of the most fundamental things that we need to appreciate or think about is what I call the thrust or the power of the daily life in Israel, the power of Israel's normality. And if you think about it, Israel experiences for ages, because of many reasons, when we had Israel experiences, we focused primarily on the what I call the orbit of the exceptional. We showed them the Masadas, the Yad Vashems, and the Kotels of Israel. But we did not pay attention to the fact that a very powerful educational message is actually showing and demonstrating the normality of Israel. In other words, that Israel is a country like any other, where there is a daily life and a daily occupation with people who are occupied with different things on a myriad of levels, just like in any other country. In that respect, the thrust of the daily is as equally important as the orbit of the exceptional. There needs to be a combination of both in order to show people that Israel is not only a conglomerate of aha moments, but that one can also experience in Israel an aha moment, lose themselves in the daily flow of life and not be engaged all the time with the fundamental, powerful questions of life. By doing so, we're actually allowing people an entry point into Israel that is not only refreshing, but is also inviting. We're showing them that Israel's greatest success, the true fulfillment of the dream of Israel, lies on the daily life of Israelis here and everybody else who joins them. Israeli Jews, Israeli non-Jews, visitors, and so on and so forth. It lies in that moment because it is the realization of the Zionist dream. It is the realization of the dream of the Jewish people to relive or to re-establish a sovereign state where people do what people do in sovereign state. So what we need to focus here about is not only the exceptionality of Israel, but also the daily, the routine, even the trivial and the mundane. They can be extremely powerful if we focus on them and turn them into an intentional pedagogy. And the last thing has to do with our narrative. We as Jewish and Israel educators need to systematically, intentionally, and thoughtfully engage in a language of Jewish identity and the establishment of a Jewish identity that is based not on a rhetoric of crisis and persecution and calamity, but rather an identity that is based on a rhetoric of opportunity, of contribution, of values and beliefs. More so, Jewish identity needs to be based on the foundations of the inner Jewish discourse, value clarification, the inner mechanisms that establish Jewish life, rather than the outer threats to Jewish living. We need to perpetuate a discussion that allows Jewish identity to be built from within and be a proactive identity rather than a Jewish identity that is shaped and formed informed by external threats and is mainly engaged in being a reactive identity. These 5 responses to the 5 challenges that I mentioned before, I believe, allow us to have a preliminary framework around which we can establish a coherent language for Jewish and Israel education. And I hope that they give you some rudimentary or basic language as you embark on this path of becoming meaningful and effective story bearers on behalf of the Jewish people. Thank you very much.